Imagine three 8-year-old boys disappearing on a quiet May afternoon. Imagine their bodies being found the next day, bound, brutalized, floating in a drainage ditch. Now imagine three teenagers being accused of this horrific crime for the sole reason that they listened to Metallica and wore black. Or, this is the true story of the West Memphis Three, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in American history, where moral panic and prejudice condemned three innocent people, while the real killer was likely never investigated. It was May 5, 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas, a small conservative town in the heart of America's Bible Belt, where everyone knows everyone and the Baptist Church is the center of social life. Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, three boys just 8 years old, rode their bikes out to play after school. They were neighbors, best friends, classmates. Typical American boys on their bicycles enjoying the freedom of a spring afternoon. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. They were supposed to come home for dinner, but they never came back. Around 7 in the evening, John Mark Byers, Christopher's stepfather, called the police to report his disappearance. The other parents soon did the same. The entire community mobilized. Neighbors searched streets, backyards, the small local woods called Robin Hood Hills. No one slept that night. And then the next morning, around 8 o'clock, the official search began with county rescue teams. What they found at 1:30 that afternoon on May 6th would change West Memphis forever and create one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern history. The bodies of all three children were found submerged in a muddy drainage ditch, hidden in the vegetation of Robin Hood Hills. They were completely naked. Their own shoelaces had been used to bind them in a grotesque position, wrists tied to ankles behind their backs. They had been brutally beaten. Christopher had genital mutilations so severe he was practically castrated. Stevie's face was lacerated. There were what appeared to be bite marks, deep scratches, possible stab wounds. The scene was one of indescribable horror. And immediately, speculation began. Little West Memphis, with its churches on every corner and its deeply religious mentality, quickly reached a terrifying conclusion. This could only be the work of Satanists. The ritualistic nature of the bound bodies, the mutilation, the isolated location in the woods, everything seemed to confirm the community's worst fears. And so the witch hunt began. The West Memphis police were completely unprepared. That small police force had never investigated anything remotely like this. Investigators made basic mistakes from the start. The crime scene was poorly preserved, evidence was contaminated, witnesses were not properly interviewed. According to investigative journalist Mara Leverett, who covered the case extensively, police records were a chaotic mess. The police even refused help from the Arkansas State Police, possibly because the local department was being investigated for corruption in the drug task force. But that didn't matter to a panicked community demanding immediate justice, and the police needed culprits quickly. Enter Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, three teenagers who stood out like exotic birds in a town of camouflage and pickup trucks. Damien was 18, a troubled kid who had dropped out of school, had a history of depression and suicide attempts. He wore black constantly, read about Wicca and the occult, listened to heavy metal. In a deeply Baptist and conservative town, he was seen as a dangerous aberration. Jason Baldwin was 16, actually an excellent student with talent for drawing and art, dreamed of studying graphic design in college. But he was Damien's best friend, shared his taste for bands like Metallica and Slayer, dressed in black. And that, in a West Memphis of '93, was enough to be suspicious. Jessie Misskelley was 17, had dropped out of school, had intellectual disabilities with an IQ measured at 72, equivalent to that of a 7-year-old child. He knew Damien and Jason from school, but they weren't close friends. He was an easily influenced, vulnerable boy. And there was a juvenile officer named Jerry Driver, who had been targeting Damien for years. Driver was convinced that Damien led a satanic cult in West Memphis. Without any concrete evidence, just prejudice and moral hysteria. When the boys were murdered, Driver immediately suggested Damien as the main suspect. The police, desperate for answers, embraced this theory. And that's where Vicki Hutchison comes in, a local woman who lived in a trailer park. She volunteered to spy on Damien in exchange for the offered reward. With police guiding every step, she claimed to have taken Jessie Misskelley to a supposed witches' meeting with Damien where, according to her, everything turned into an orgy. It was an absurd story, but the police believed it, or pretended to believe it because they needed something, anything. On June 3, 1993, police brought Jessie Misskelley in for interrogation. A 17-year-old boy with severe intellectual disabilities, without a lawyer, without his parents present. For 12 hours, they pressured him, manipulated him, threatened him, promised him money. The police recorded less than an hour of this half-day interrogation, and finally, exhausted and confused, Jessie confessed. He said he had helped Damien and Jason kill the 3 boys, said it was a satanic ritual. The police had their confession. They had their culprits. The case was solved. Or was it? Because Jessie's confession was a disaster of contradictions. He said the boys were tied with rope, when in fact they were tied with their own shoelaces. He said the attack happened in the morning when the children were provably at school. He said 2 of the boys were sexually abused when the autopsy showed no signs of sexual abuse. Practically every detail of the confession was wrong. Experts would later say it was obvious that Jessie was simply repeating back to police what they wanted to hear. A well-documented phenomenon in coerced false confessions, especially from people with cognitive disabilities. And the moment Jessie was released to his family, he immediately recanted, said the police forced him through threats and promises of money to tell that story. But it was too late. The judicial machine was already in motion. In June of '93, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley were arrested and charged with murder. There was no physical evidence connecting any of them to the crime. There was no weapon. There was no motive. There was no connection to the victims. All the prosecution had was the false and recanted confession of a boy with intellectual disabilities, dubious circumstantial testimonies, and the appearance of the accused. But in a terrorized community thirsting for vengeance, that would be enough. The trials began in January of '94. Jessie was tried separately. His lawyer, Dan Stidham, a young public defender with no jury trial experience, did the best he could. He argued the confession had been coerced, pointed out all the inconsistencies, tried to show that Jessie simply didn't understand what he was saying. But the jury didn't care. On February 4, 1994, Jessie Misskelley was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. He was 17 years old. A few days later began the joint trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. The prosecution relied on a cult expert who said the defendants' CD collection and their black clothes were indicators of satanic cult activity. They presented Vicki Hutchison's testimony about the alleged witches' meeting, even though she would later admit to lying under police pressure. They presented 2 girls who claimed to have heard Damien confess during a softball game. A cellmate said Baldwin confessed to him. It was all circumstantial, all dubious, but it was inflammatory. The defense tried to present other suspects, including a local teenager who fled to California right after the bodies were discovered, and who even said he might have committed the crimes before recanting. The judge refused to allow him to testify. Jessie Misskelley refused to testify against his co-defendants, even when offered a reduced sentence in exchange, a courageous decision that showed character. But this meant his confession, inadmissible because he wasn't available for cross-examination, couldn't be officially used in Damien and Jason's trial. Officially. But we'll see that wasn't quite the case. On March 18, 1994, after just 1 day of deliberation, the jury declared Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin guilty of first-degree murder. Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Jason, who was only 16 and an exemplary student, was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The West Memphis Three, as the press already called them, were condemned. 3 teenagers accused of heinous crimes based essentially on their appearance and musical tastes, and the true story of the murders remained untold. But something extraordinary was about to happen. In 1996, 2 years after the convictions, HBO released a documentary called Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. The filmmakers had started filming expecting to document the conviction of obvious culprits. But the more they investigated, the more horrified they became by what they discovered. The documentary exposed the terrifying fragility of the evidence, showed the grotesque failures in police investigation, revealed the prejudices that had guided the convictions. It was the first time the band Metallica allowed their music to be used in a film, specifically to draw attention to the case, and it worked. The documentary generated national and international outrage. Investigative journalists began unearthing more problems with the case. Advocacy groups began to form, and then celebrities began speaking out. Johnny Depp became one of the most vocal supporters and a personal friend of Damien. Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, Flea of Red Hot Chili Peppers, Henry Rollins, who organized a musical project with Lemmy Kilmister, Tom Araya, Iggy Pop, the Dixie Chicks, with Natalie Maines speaking publicly about the injustice of the case. Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings. Global attention was now focused on West Memphis, and pressure for justice was increasing exponentially. Defense attorneys worked tirelessly through the 90s and 2000s, filing appeal after appeal. Private investigators discovered evidence the police ignored or never even looked for. And then, in 2007, came the game changer. New DNA testing technology was available, and the results were devastating for the prosecution. No genetic material from the crime scene matched Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Misskelley. Zero. Nothing. They were scientifically excluded. But the DNA found something interesting. A hair strand found in the knots that bound one of the victims was consistent with Terry Hobbs's DNA, Stevie Branch's stepfather. Another hair strand found on a tree stump near the crime scene was consistent with David Jacoby, a friend of Terry Hobbs whom he had visited at approximately the time the boys disappeared. Terry Hobbs, a man with a violent history who was never properly investigated, a man whose alibi had inconsistencies, a man who was seen by witnesses calling the three boys to come back home at exactly the time they disappeared. Witnesses who were never interviewed by police at the time. In 2009, 3 witnesses came forward with sworn statements. They said that Michael Hobbs Jr., Terry's nephew, told them, "My Uncle Terry killed 3 boys in West Memphis. He called it the Hobbs family secret." When questioned, Terry Hobbs denied any involvement but refused to provide dental impressions for comparison with bite marks found on Stevie's body. Pamela Hobbs, Stevie's mother and Terry's ex-wife, came forward in 2009. In a devastating statement to federal court, she said that after the murders, she found in Terry's drawer a knife that Stevie constantly carried, a knife she believed was with her son when he died. She said her sister saw Terry washing clothes, sheets and curtains from Stevie's room at a strange time, right after the murders, and she declared publicly that she believed Terry Hobbs was involved in her son's death. Other allegations emerged. In 2013, 2 men, Billy Wayne Stewart and Benny Guy, gave sworn statements alleging that Terry Hobbs, David Jacoby, and 2 teenagers from a local trailer park showed up at Stewart's house on the night of May 5th looking to buy marijuana. They bought some. Stewart claimed to have seen Hobbs and Jacoby kissing in a pickup truck. He alleged that Hobbs was bisexual with a preference for young boys. And then Stewart's partner, Benny Guy, recounted in detail what one of the teenagers, named Buddy Lucas, allegedly told him in April of '95. According to Lucas, after buying the drugs, the group intercepted the 3 boys on their way home. There was a fight. The situation escalated horribly, and it resulted in the brutal murders. Lucas claimed to have fled terrified, but Hobbs, Jacoby, and the other teenager stayed. These allegations were never fully investigated by West Memphis police. When Terry Hobbs was interviewed after the 2007 DNA results, the interview was, according to one of the defense attorneys, comical. They asked 2 or 3 superficial questions and dismissed the man. To this day, Terry Hobbs has never been charged, and the West Memphis Police Department considers the case closed with the convictions of the West Memphis Three. But back to Damien, Jason, and Jessie. With all the new DNA evidence, the revelations about juror misconduct, it was discovered that the jury foreman who convicted Damien and Jason had discussed the case extensively with his own attorney during the trial, and illegally introduced Jessie's inadmissible confession into deliberations to convince the other jurors. With all the weight of public opinion shifting, the Arkansas Supreme Court finally ordered in 2010 that a lower court judge consider whether the new DNA evidence could exonerate the three men. The prosecution knew a new trial would likely result in acquittal. They had lost witnesses who had recanted. They had lost evidence over time. They had a defense now formed by the best lawyers in the country working pro bono, and they had modern forensic science that would destroy them. But the state of Arkansas didn't want to admit error. They didn't want to pay compensation. They didn't want the national shame of acknowledging they had imprisoned 3 innocent people for 18 years. So they offered a deal, a rare type of guilty plea called an Alford plea, where the defendant can plead guilty while maintaining their innocence, while acknowledging that the prosecution has sufficient evidence for conviction. For Damien, who was on death row awaiting his 3rd execution date, the choice was impossible but obvious. Continue fighting and possibly be executed while the appeals process dragged on, or accept the deal and finally get out of prison. On August 19, 2011, the 3 men entered the courtroom. Damien Echols, now 36 years old, having spent 18 years on death row, much of it in solitary confinement. Jason Baldwin, now 34, having entered prison as a promising 16-year-old student. Jessie Misskelley, now 36, having spent almost half his life behind bars. They accepted the Alford plea. They were sentenced to time served, and they were released. Jason Baldwin would later say in an interview with Rolling Stone, "The state used our musical taste to destroy us. And in the end, many of those same artists helped us win freedom." The irony was bitter but real. Damien moved to New England, became an artist and activist against wrongful convictions, married Lori Davis, a landscape architect who had become one of the case's greatest advocates after watching the documentary. Jason moved to Washington, worked on films and books about the case. Only Jessie remained in West Memphis, working in construction, avoiding the press, trying to rebuild a destroyed life. They were free, but not exonerated. Technically, they're still convicted murderers, and that means they receive no compensation for the 18 stolen years. They receive no official apologies, and they carry forever the stigma of convictions for child murder. Today, in 2025, the case remains alive. In November of 2025, after years of legal battle, case evidence was finally sent to Bode Laboratory for advanced DNA testing. MVAC DNA technology can recover genetic material from places that were impossible decades ago. The shoelaces that bound the boys, for example. The hope is that the DNA of the person who made those knots is still there. And finally, after more than 30 years, the complete truth can emerge. But there's a devastating problem. In July of 2021, it was reported that much of the physical evidence related to the 3 victims was lost, misplaced, or destroyed by the West Memphis Police Department. In 2025, this evidence was miraculously found in a box belonging to the police department itself. But how much other evidence has been lost forever? This case is a terrifying study of everything that can go wrong in the criminal justice system. It shows how prejudice and moral panic can replace real investigation. It shows how false confessions can be coerced from vulnerable people. It shows how juries can be influenced by dubious testimony and fake experts. It shows how inconvenient evidence can be ignored when it doesn't fit the desired narrative. And it shows how, even when science proves innocence, the system is reluctant to admit error. The West Memphis Three case happened at the height of what's called the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. A moral hysteria without basis in reality where lawyers, psychologists, and police convinced themselves that American children were suffering widespread and secret satanic ritual abuse. The evidence was virtually non-existent, but it resulted in several wrongful convictions that were later overturned. The San Antonio Four in Texas, the McMartin and Fells Acres daycare cases, convictions based on fantastical testimonies from coerced children and collective panic. 3 innocent boys were brutally murdered in West Memphis in 1993. Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore deserve justice. Their families deserve truth. But Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley are not the culprits. They were just different teenagers in a town that didn't tolerate difference. And they paid a price that no human being should pay for simply being who they were. Meanwhile, Whoever really killed those 3 boys probably never faced consequences. Terry Hobbs continues denying any involvement. No charges have been filed. No serious investigation has been conducted, and the official case remains closed. Today, most of the victims' parents no longer believe the West Memphis Three are guilty. John Mark Byers, Christopher's stepfather, who was initially one of the most vocal supporters of the convictions, completely changed his mind after the 2007 DNA results. He said he felt like Benedict Arnold, betraying everything he believed for 14 years, but that the evidence was impossible to ignore. Pamela Hobbs, as Stevie's mother, declared in 2011, "I want true justice and now we'll never know. I thought there was going to be a trial, and those incompetent cops and prosecutors, the investigators who were on this case in '93, they screwed it all up. And now the state of Arkansas, it's like they want to sweep it all under the rug and it's over. It's over for everyone else. But it continues living for me every day." As we await the results of new DNA tests that may finally bring answers decades too late, the story of the West Memphis Three remains as a somber reminder. A reminder that justice is not automatic, that the system can fail catastrophically, that prejudice kills, that appearance and musical taste are not evidence of crime, and that 3 boys who liked Metallica and wore black lost their youths, almost lost their lives, because a panicked community needed monsters and decided they would do. Stevie, Christopher, and Michael deserve to have their true killers found. Damien, Jason, and Jessie deserve full exoneration, and we all deserve to learn from this horror so it never happens again. But as long as prejudice exists, as long as moral panic can replace evidence, as long as appearance can be used as proof of guilt, the tragedy of the West Memphis Three will remain relevant. And that's the scariest story of all. Because if it happened to them, it can happen to anyone.